Some mornings don't just begin, they arrive like a challenge. The light feels sharper, the air a little heavier, and every sound around you seems to echo more than it should. That Thursday at Fort Holloway was one of those mornings. The hangar was alive with its usual orchestra, the whine of power tools, the clink of metal on metal, the hiss of compressed air. Aviation fuel hung thick in the air, mixing with the faint tang of hydraulic fluid. Somewhere, a radio played a song too faint to make out, its melody warped by static. I was already streaked with oil by the time the first round of snickering started. My coveralls bore the marks of yesterday's work, black smudges across my knees and sleeves, a long streak of grease running from my collarbone to my hip. My gloves were wet from pulling a stubborn valve free, and my hair, despite my best effort that morning, had begun to escape the elastic holding it back. My name is Emma Hayes, Specialist Aircraft Mechanic. At least, that's what the patch on my chest says. Around here, most people just call me Grease Monkey. Not in a friendly way. More like the name of a sideshow act they're not sure belongs in the main tent. I've learned not to correct them. The less they know, the better. My life before Fort Holloway isn't something I talk about, and not because it's uninteresting. If anything, it's the opposite. People think they want stories until they hear the ones that don't have happy endings. But there's one thing I can't hide: the tattoo. It stretches across my upper back, a weave of sharp lines and curling arcs, black ink standing bold against pale skin. Every stroke was earned, though no one here knows how. They don't see it for what it is, they see decoration. And so they invent stories. Drunken dares, rebellious phases, a weekend trip to Vegas. It's easier for them to laugh than to admit they don't understand it. I was under the belly of an AC, 1:30 that morning, elbows deep in its landing gear assembly. The job was messy, and that's how I liked it. When you're buried in the machinery, the world narrows down to bolts, pistons, and hydraulic lines. The rest, the whispers, the sideways glances, fades into background noise. Except for Private Daniel Ross. Ross was 22, all bright eyes and swagger, the kind of man who'd never had a bad day in the field because he'd never really seen the field. He had an easy laugh and a sharp tongue, and he never passed up a chance to aim both in my direction. "You ready to pretend you're a real mechanic again, Hayes?" His voice came from somewhere behind my boots. I didn't answer. Instead, I adjusted my grip on the wrench and kept my eyes on the task. "Hey, Grease Monkey," he said, louder this time. "I'm talking to you." Still nothing from me. Years in uniform have taught me the value of silence. That's when his backup arrived. Private Miller, always bouncing on his feet, like he had too much caffeine in his system, chimed in. "Maybe she can't hear you over the sound of her own mistakes," he said. And then Webb, tall, wiry, and mean in the way that comes from needing to prove himself, added, "Or maybe she's too busy pretending that tattoo means something." I kept working, but I felt the heat in my chest. Pack mentality. It's predictable. Find someone different, and make them the target. It makes the group feel closer, safer. I've seen it before, in places far less forgiving than this hangar. But that morning, something shifted. It was subtle. The way conversations tapered off, tools quieted, heads turned. The kind of hush that doesn't just happen. Someone important had stepped into the room. I didn't look up right away. The hydraulic coupling in front of me needed my attention more than whoever was inspecting the place. But the energy had changed. Even Ross and his crew quieted, though I could still feel their eyes on me. And then a voice, close and certain. "Specialist Hayes." I turned my head slightly, and there he was, Colonel Robert Maddox. Maddox had the kind of presence that didn't need volume to be felt. His uniform was pressed sharp enough to cut, his boots polished to a mirror shine. His hair was silver, but there was nothing soft about him. His eyes, a pale, unyielding blue, studied people the way a pilot studies a storm, calculating the safest path through it. I slid out from under the AC, 1:30 enough to meet his gaze. "Sir, tell me about the engine problem," he said. No clipboard, no assistant taking notes, just his voice and his attention. For a few precious minutes, the noise in the hangar faded into nothing. I explained the hydraulic issue, my suspicion that the secondary fuel system might be the real culprit, and the sequence I was following to confirm it. He listened, Not like a man ticking boxes for an inspection, but like one who understood every moving part one mentioned. As I leaned forward to point out the damaged line, the collar of my coveralls slipped just enough for the tattoo to show. I didn't notice it, but I noticed Ross shifting in my peripheral vision. "Sir," Ross said suddenly, his tone too casual to be genuine. "Some of us were wondering about certain personal decorations in the workplace, whether they're appropriate." Maddox's head turned toward him, slow and deliberate, like a gun turret locking on target. "And what do you know about that tattoo, Private?" Ross hesitated. "Just looks like some comic book art, sir. Not exactly military." The colonel's eyes narrowed just enough to be noticeable. His voice was calm, but I could hear steel under it. "Is that so?" The air felt thicker. I could feel the attention of everyone in the hangar now, waiting. Maddox looked back at me. "Hayes," he said, "step forward." The space between Maddox's order and my first step felt longer than it was. The entire hangar had gone still, like someone had hit pause on a film reel. The smell of oil, the faint whir of a fan somewhere overhead, the tick-tick of cooling metal, all of it sharpened in the quiet. I stepped out from under the shadow of the AC, 130, wiping my hands on a rag that was already too dirty to do much good. My boots made soft thuds on the concrete, each one swallowed by the heavy air between me and the colonel. Colonel Robert Maddox wasn't tall in the way that intimidated by size. He didn't need to be. His authority came from somewhere deeper. His eyes, a pale frost blue, held the same kind of stillness you find in deep water, beautiful, but with the unspoken warning that you don't know how far down it goes. He studied me for a moment, saying nothing. I could feel every other set of eyes in the hangar doing the same, curiosity mixing with something else, the kind of anticipation that comes when people sense they're about to witness something unusual. "Turn," Maddox said quietly. I did, facing away from him, my shoulders straight. The open edge of my coverall slid down just far enough to reveal more of the tattoo, black arcs and sharp lines interwoven into something both intricate and deliberate. I felt the room's attention narrow to that one patch of ink. There was a pause. Then the soft rasp of fabric as Maddox rolled up his sleeve. Gasps, small and voluntary, came from somewhere behind me. Even without looking, I knew why. He had it too. The same design, older and faded by time, but still unmistakable. The realization spread through the hangar like a ripple across still water. The younger mechanics froze mid-task. The veterans, the ones who had been around long enough to know certain things aren't talked about, looked away out of instinct. Maddox didn't move for several seconds. Then he stepped around to face me, his gaze level. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and gave me a salute. I returned it without hesitation, though my heartbeat was anything but steady. My hand was steady because it had to be. My mind, though, that was already turning over what this meant. A colonel saluting a specialist in front of an entire crew wasn't just unusual, it was deliberate. A message. Maddox's voice was even when he finally spoke, but it carried through the hangar. "Private Ross," he said without looking away from me. Ross's voice came back smaller than usual. "Sir, these markings," Maddox said, tapping the edge of his own tattoo, "aren't for show. They are not decoration. They are not comic book art. They are earned, each line, each curve, by people who have completed missions you will never read about. Operations that never existed on paper, in places that don't appear on any map you've seen." The words hung heavy in the air. "When you mock them," Maddox continued, "you are mocking the service of those who have risked more than you can imagine. You are mocking sacrifices made far from the safety of this hangar. And in this case," he glanced at me, "you are mocking a combat veteran who has already proven more than you have yet dreamed of." Ross's complexion drained of its usual flush. Miller shifted awkwardly beside him. Webb suddenly found something deeply fascinating about the floor. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the AC, 130, seemed to be holding its breath. From the corner of my eye, I saw Staff Sergeant Michael Grant step forward, his expression unreadable but his tone carrying weight. "The team will treat Specialist Hayes with the respect she's earned, sir. I'll see to it personally." Maddox gave a single, satisfied nod. "Good." He glanced back toward the aircraft. Now, specialist, tell me more about your suspicion regarding the secondary fuel system. It took a second for me to pull my mind back into the technical reality of the problem. I outlined my reasoning, the irregular pressure readings, the possibility of a microfracture in the line, the bypass test I planned to run. Maddox listened, nodding once in approval. Behind us, the others began moving again, but the noise level never returned to what it had been. The energy had shifted, curiosity replaced by something that felt an awful lot like respect. When Maddox finally stepped away to continue his inspection, I returned to the AC-130's belly. The same bolts, the same hydraulic lines, but my space felt different. No one crowded close. No one muttered under their breath. Ross and his crew kept their distance. It's a strange thing, watching the air change around you without you doing much of anything. Respect, real respect, doesn't come from snapping back or throwing punches. It comes from truth being revealed at the right moment, in a way no one can argue with. As I tightened the last bolt of the morning, I caught sight of Maddox across the hangar. He was talking to another officer, but his eyes flicked toward me for half a second, enough to tell me that whatever had just happened wasn't random. It had been intentional, and intentional actions always have a purpose. When Colonel Maddox's eyes met mine again, it wasn't the gaze of a stranger. It was the quiet recognition of someone who knew exactly where I'd been, and what it had cost to come back. I'd seen that look before, years ago, though never from him. It was the same expression worn by people who've been to the edge of something and returned with pieces missing. Specialist Hayes, he said, stepping closer so that the rest of the hangar faded into the background. Face the rest of the team. I turned, the loose collar of my coveralls slipping far enough to reveal the upper curve of the tattoo in full. The design wasn't pretty in the conventional sense. It wasn't meant to be. The interlocking lines were precise, deliberate, each etched into my skin with a meaning I'd carried silently for years. Maddox's gaze lingered on it, his expression unreadable. Then, without breaking eye contact, he tugged his sleeve higher. The room shifted. People leaned just slightly forward, drawn toward the moment like moths to a porch light. And then they saw it, his tattoo, faded with age but identical in structure. The gasp from one of the younger mechanics was barely audible, but it was enough to spark a chain reaction. A ripple of whispers broke out, hushed and uncertain, as the reality began to sink in. Here was a man whose career had spanned decades, whose chest carried more ribbons than most of the crew would ever earn, and he wore the same mark as the grease monkey they'd spent months mocking. Maddox let them look, let them make the connection. Then, with a measured calm, he raised his right hand and saluted me. The sound in the hangar died instantly. You could have heard a single drop of oil hit the floor. I returned the salute, my arm steady, though my heartbeat pounded in my ears. I wasn't saluting the rank, I was saluting the man. And in that moment, I knew he wasn't saluting the specialist patch on my uniform, either. He was saluting the history behind the ink. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the hangar with a precision that didn't need volume to command attention. These markings, he said, tapping his sleeve once, aren't just for decoration. They are not chosen, they are earned. Each line represents a story that will never appear in a mission log. Each curve is a risk taken for reasons that will never be written down. They are marks of service in places that officially do not exist. The words weren't theatrical. They weren't meant to impress. They were the simple, undeniable truth. He let the silence stretch a heartbeat longer before turning toward Private Ross. When you mock Specialist Hayes' tattoo, Maddox said, you didn't just mock her. You mocked every person who has carried this mark into places you can't begin to imagine. You mocked sacrifices you will never be asked to make. Ross's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Miller shifted uncomfortably beside him, and Webb kept his eyes fixed on the floor, as if looking anywhere else might make the moment pass faster. Disrespect, Maddox continued, isn't just an attitude problem. It's a weakness. And in this line of work, weakness gets people killed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight behind the words was heavier than any shout. From my left, Staff Sergeant Michael Grant stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Colonel, the team understands. We'll treat Specialist Hayes with the respect she's earned. You have my word. Maddox nodded once. Good. See that you do. He turned back to me, his eyes softening just slightly. Now, about that secondary fuel system you mentioned. The shift from confrontation to work was abrupt but deliberate. I launched into the technical details, the pressure irregularities, the probable microfracture in the fuel line, the bypass test I intended to run. Maddox listened intently, offering a subtle tip about a common weak point in the system's design. We moved together back toward the AC, 130, our conversation low but technical. Behind us, the rest of the hangar cautiously resumed their work, though the chatter was gone. The sound was purely mechanical now, tools clinking, metal groaning, the hum of machinery. And yet, beneath the surface, something had shifted. For months, I'd been a ghost in this hangar, tolerated at best, ignored at worst. But now, eyes followed me for a different reason. There was no more smirking when I passed by. No more whispered commentary when my back was turned. It wasn't friendliness, not yet. Respect doesn't turn into camaraderie overnight. But it was enough. Enough to work in peace. Enough to be heard when I spoke. As the day wore on, I caught glimpses of Maddox in conversation with other officers, his presence as commanding as ever. But every so often, his gaze would drift my way. Just a flicker, a reminder that this morning's display hadn't been accidental. He'd meant to reveal the connection, meant to make the mark on my back known. And in the military, actions that deliberate always have an agenda. The question was, whose? The shift in the hangar after that morning wasn't dramatic at first. It didn't explode into sudden friendships or open praise. No one clapped me on the back or invited me to join them for drinks. Respect, the real kind, doesn't arrive with fireworks. It creeps in like the dawn, the light changing so gradually you almost don't notice until you look around and realize everything is different. For the first few days, the biggest change was the absence of noise. The muttered comments when I passed? Gone. The sarcastic quips tossed my way in the middle of a job? Silent. Ross, Miller, and Webb kept their voices low when I was in earshot. They didn't look at me much, but when they did, it wasn't with that smug glint I'd grown used to. It was quiet, but it wasn't awkward. In fact, it was the kind of quiet I could work with. Colonel Maddox didn't come back immediately, but his presence lingered like a shadow in the corner of the hangar. Everyone knew he could show up again at any moment, and that knowledge seemed to hang over Ross and his crew like a weight. Staff Sergeant Michael Grant was the first to break the new silence. 2 days after Maddox's visit, he stopped by my workstation while I was reassembling a landing gear actuator. "How's it coming?" he asked, his tone neutral but lacking the clipped impatience I'd often heard before. "Better than expected," I replied, not looking up from the torque wrench in my hand. "Secondary cylinders clean. No signs of wear." Grant nodded, resting a hand on the edge of the workbench. "You were right about that AC, 130 last week. Maddox's tip led you straight to the fault." I allowed myself a small smile. "Yeah, microfracture in the auxiliary line. Would have been a nightmare in flight." Grant's gaze was steady. "You know, most of the crew's starting to figure out you're not just a grease monkey. Word travels faster than a pressure leak." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The work flowed easier after that. Some of the younger mechanics, ones who'd mostly stayed out of the mess before, started asking for my opinion on troubleshooting. They weren't exactly flocking to me, but they no longer skirted my corner of the hangar like it was cursed ground. Even Ross seemed to understand the new order. He kept his head down, speaking only when necessary. I didn't expect an apology. In the military, those don't come often, and when they do, they're usually buried under layers of indirect gestures. But I caught him more than once pausing before approaching, like he was weighing his words carefully. One late afternoon, I was bent over an open-engine panel when the sound of unfamiliar tires rolling across the hangar floor caught my attention. Not the heavy tread of a supply truck. This was smoother, quieter. I straightened, wiping my hands on a rag, just in time to see a black government sedan ease to a stop near the far wall. Its paint gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the windows tinted dark enough to make it impossible to see who was inside. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. Civilian clothes, tailored trousers, a fitted jacket, but her posture told a different story. She walked like someone used to wearing a uniform, with the same measured steps and situational awareness. Her hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense twist, and she carried a leather portfolio under one arm. Her gaze swept the hanger once, sharp and assessing, before locking onto me. She crossed the space between us without hesitation. "Specialist Emma Hayes?" Her voice was calm, confident. "That's me," I said, resting the rag over my shoulder. She extended a hand. "Sarah Mitchell, Department of Defense." I shook it, her grip firm. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" She glanced briefly at the AC, 130 behind me, then back. "I think the question is, what can you do for us?" She held out the portfolio. "This is for your eyes only." I took it, flipping it open enough to see the words Hybrid Operations Program stamped across the first page. Below that, a description: Joint Technical and Field Specialist Units, integrating covert operations into civilian environments. The language was careful, but I could read between the lines. This wasn't about fixing engines on a safe, well-lit base. This was about blending engineering expertise with boots-on-the-ground intelligence work, the kind of assignments where things could go wrong fast and quietly. I looked up. "Why me?" Mitchell smiled faintly. "Because people who carry that tattoo on their backs aren't easy to find. And because Colonel Maddox says you're one of the best he's ever worked with." That gave me pause. Maddox hadn't said much directly to me beyond the morning in the hangar and a few technical exchanges. But apparently, he'd been talking behind the scenes. Mitchell's tone softened slightly. "It's not a deployment in the traditional sense. It's targeted, precise. You'd be working in small teams, most of the time in plain clothes, supporting missions that require technical precision and a certain resilience." Resilience. That was the polite way of saying the ability to keep going when things get ugly. I closed the portfolio and handed it back. "It's tempting, but I've got work here. I've finally got a crew that doesn't treat me like a punchline. That's worth something." She tilted her head. "Sometimes peace is worth keeping. Sometimes it's just the space between battles. You'll have to decide which this is." Before I could answer, she handed me a plain envelope. "There's a contact number inside. No deadline. But opportunities like this don't usually circle back." With that, she turned and walked back to the sedan. The engine purred to life, and in moments, the car had disappeared down the access road. I stood there for a long minute, envelope in hand, feeling the weight of it even though it was barely more than paper. Grant appeared at my side, his expression unreadable. "Friend of yours." "Something like that," I said, slipping the envelope into my pocket. He gave a low hum of thought. "If you want my advice, think hard before you say no. And think harder before you say yes." That night, long after the hangar lights dimmed, I sat on my bunk staring at the envelope on the table. The base was quiet, save for the faint hum of the ventilation system. It's one thing to walk away from the past because you're done with it. It's another to have the past knock on your door and offer you a ride. And the thing was, I wasn't sure which this was. The envelope sat on my table for 3 days before I opened it. I told myself I was busy. The AC, 130 still needed follow-up checks, and 2 of the younger mechanics were struggling with the hydraulic calibration on a transport plane. I told myself the delay was practical. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to look at what was inside. On the 3rd night, I slid a thumb under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a single business card, black with silver lettering. A name, a number, no title. Just beneath the contact info, in small print, were the words "no second offers." It wasn't subtle. The next morning, I found Michael Grant leaning against a toolbox near the back of the hangar. He was sipping coffee that smelled strong enough to strip paint. "You've been thinking about it," he said before I even spoke. I didn't bother denying it. "You've done field work, right? Real covert stuff." Grant's eye stayed on his coffee, but his voice was even. "A long time ago." "Was it worth it?" He took a slow sip. "Depends on what you mean by worth. You want excitement? It'll give you that. Purpose? Yeah, in doses. But you'll trade something for it. Normal life. Predictable days. You lose the small comforts without realizing how much they mattered." I thought about the quiet of my corner in the hangar. The way the work kept my hands busy and my mind steady. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid, reliable. Sometimes, Grant added, peace is just the time between battles, and sometimes it's the thing you fight for. He looked at me directly then. The question is which it is for you. I didn't answer him that day. By the end of the week, my mind was made up. If I stayed, I'd keep the stability I'd fought to earn. But the tattoo on my back wasn't just a record of where I'd been. It was a reminder of who I was. And who I was didn't stay in one place when there was work to be done. So I called the number. The voice on the other end didn't ask who I was. They already knew. The conversation was short, a meeting, a date, a location. No details beyond that. Before I could go anywhere, I had work to finish. I spent my final days at Fort Holloway making sure the hangar would keep running without me. I trained Miller and a few of the others on procedures they'd never paid attention to before. I left behind a stack of manuals, each one marked with notes and shortcuts learned through years of trial and error. Ross approached me once, near the end. He didn't apologize outright, but he did say, "You were better than I gave you credit for." It wasn't much, but it was enough. 2 days before I was set to leave, Colonel Maddox appeared again. He found me halfway through a gear inspection, my hands black with grease. "You've done important work here," he said without preamble. "The respect you've earned will outlast your time in this hangar. That's not something everyone can claim." I met his eyes. "You recommended me for the program." He didn't confirm it, but the faint quirk at the corner of his mouth was answer enough. "Be careful," he added. "There's a reason they don't put the details on paper." We shook hands. No salute this time, just a simple, firm grip between equals. My last morning at Fort Holloway, I arrived before dawn. The hangar was still, the aircraft lined up like silent sentinels. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, and the air smelled faintly of cold metal and yesterday's fuel. I walked the length of the floor one final time, running a hand along the wing of the AC. 130 I'd spent so many hours repairing. It was ready now, the kind of ready that made me proud to sign my name on the maintenance log. By midday, my bag was packed. My tools were cleaned and stored, my corner of the hangar empty. Grant was there when I left. "Don't disappear completely," he said. "No promises," I replied. The black sedan was waiting outside the base gates. Sarah Mitchell stepped out as I approached, her jacket immaculate despite the wind. "Ready?" she asked. I glanced back once at the hangar. The wide doors open, the sound of work already in motion inside. The crew wasn't watching. They had their own jobs to focus on. And that was how I wanted it. "Yeah," I said. "I'm ready." The ride was quiet, the landscape sliding past in muted colors. Mitchell didn't speak until we were well clear of the base. "You'll be briefed when we arrive. It's not just about what you can fix, Hayes. It's about what you can keep running under pressure, and who you can keep standing when things go wrong." I nodded, the weight of her words settling in my chest. The road ahead wasn't familiar, but it felt right. The tattoo on my back wasn't just ink, it was a compass, and it was pointing me toward the kind of work I'd been built for. As the sedan turned off the main road and into a stretch of quiet, tree-lined asphalt, I let myself wonder how long it would take before this new post started to feel like home. Maybe it never would. Maybe that was the point. That's the thing about living in the shadows. You learn to move without expecting comfort. You take your light where you find it. And sometimes, that's enough. The base faded from view behind me, replaced by the hum of the engine and the road stretching ahead. Respect, once earned, changes everything. It changes how people see you, and more importantly, how you see yourself. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth stepping back into the unknown for.